Okay, and as we move through part two of social movements, we see some of the contemporary scenes here where people are contesting the powerful and also rethinking about what it means to be a great leader, right? It's not just a male who is eloquent, articulate, and speaks to the press and is seen in imagery, but in today's society, we have multiple leaders, right? And we just see people coming together as a collective. There's not one voice that the press goes and focuses on. We see movements that have arrived. Marriage equality, I go back to 2015, on June 26, when the Supreme Court ruled. We know now that this is in peril, as during the last recent tenure of the Supreme Court, we see many cases rolling back, even aimed at the LGBTQIA plus community. In the Colorado case, so we see leaders expanding beyond that paradigm of there is one. There are many, and there are different genders, across sexuality, across race. One of the movements that emerged over a decade ago was the Occupy movement that challenged socioeconomic or class inequality in the United States. And this is where the mantra of we are the 99% emerges from. The 99% of the workers under the neoliberal economic order in the United States and globally. This begins in New York, it blossoms across the country and even across the globe. Also, some of the biggest mobilizations we saw in the United States were in 2006, the immigrant rights movement in response to House Resolution 4437. That was a very draconian immigration policy, and we've seen many more since. It even emerges and gets a president elected in 2016. So these policies have been in play for lots of time, but the people have always pushed back and mobilized against it. Also, going virtual, social media became a norm, going back to this epoch. For us all now, in this moment, it's part of us, but this was something that emerges from those movements. It was also a movement to end Senate Bill 1070 and Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Arizona, another very where immigrant rights activists really organized to finally oust the sheriff, who then came under federal investigation for racially profiling. And this was a law that allowed him to do, namely Latinos in the United States. And in Arizona, this was also known as the Show Me Your Papers, Please. Anyone who was perceived to be undocumented in Arizona was allowed to be stopped and interrogated. And we see these movements, social movements that go global. The Arab Spring that began in 2010, Tunisia. This is an image of Tahrir Square in Egypt, in Yemen, Syria, and more across the African continent, the Mideast. Going back to, we showed the images of the Chilean winter in 2011, Syria, that became a disastrous a scene of war and pillage and death. And dreamers, undocumented students who are still to this day continue to organize. Movements against the prison industrial complex. We watched 13th. We saw the issue of mass incarceration and people who have been mobilizing against it for decades. And so many call themselves abolitionists, right? And there was an abolition movement, again, that was a movement against chattel slavery up until the Civil War. These were abolitionists who were seeking to end and undo slavery across the United States. And of course, that leads to the secession of the Confederate States, the Southern states, who established their own, or attempted to establish their own domain, and then they commenced the Civil War of 1861 through 65. So the abolitionists today against the mass incarceration derive their inspiration from abolitionists of the 19th century. So, and the resistance under Trumpism, something that ended, but is still here with us, as we see, right? People taking to the streets and organizing against policies right on the commencement of his presidency. We see the Black Lives Matter movement really focusing on not only but primarily on the killing by police of African male and females and other people across races and across genders and across sexualities. And indigenous resistance. This has been something that goes back to the moment of contact. This is the story that we see going back, hundreds and hundreds of years, right? We all know the story. 1492, Columbus comes in and discovers the Americas. That's the European discovery of this side of the world. And indigenous people have been resisting ever since and to the present. And here locally in the Bay Area, here at DVC, we see some of our students who are indigenous, who are engaged in some of the not only preservation of culture, but also trying to seek and build back a new world that was actually part of their world. So we know in 2016, a big social movement and a form of resistance at Standing Rock, where the Dakota Access Pipeline, was, desecrating the land and contaminating the water, but all under the principles of neoliberalism. We go back to that economic theory that capital can flow, capital can build and expand, and this is what they were doing, right? Building that pipeline, private corporations, taking precedence over indigenous land and contaminating the earth. And also movements by youth, and this goes way back back into the birth of MTV. And I recall this, they launched the youth vote, hip hop, MTV, and politics. And they had a rock the vote campaign, get people involved in the electoral process. People became enacted. They believed that they had efficacy and came together on a number of issues. Social media and politics. And we see here, I have this graph just to show how social media, if you think back to the slide I showed to before, where immigrant rights activists were using social media in 2013, now it is part of all of us and part of every social movement across the world. People are communicating. States begin to shut down certain apparatus. Here in the United States, they're talking about banning TikTok, and banning other forms of censor. Or, we're going to see this come up in the next presidential election. And sports and politics. Sports and politics has always been a part of sports, right? Here we have Colin Kaepernick again, Muhammad Ali, who was one of the greatest heavyweight fighters of all time, the heavyweight champ, who was stripped of his title and almost forced into poverty during his prime because he stood up for certain principles and against going off to the war in Vietnam at the time, and also against the forms of discrimination that blacks and African Americans were taking here in the streets in the United States, similar to the 1968 Black Power salute. On the flip side, we have, African American, another boxer, Joe Louis, being used by the nation state in order to recruit and maintain support for the war. And social movements started here in the realm of education. And this image here that you see here, Concerned Student 1950, was begun by one student, a graduate PhD student at the University of Missouri, to contest the inaction of the university in resolving any of the racial injustices that had been occurring on campus, you can say forever, until that point where somebody stood up and said no more. This graduate student would camp out. I believe he was on a hunger strike. It was kind of going unnoticed. And the moment that he was attempting to disrupt every day people walked right by him. It wasn't until the football team at the University of Missouri took notice and then said, hey, this involves us. Hey, we will not play on Saturday. And that is when the administration came to a screeching halt and said, okay, we'll listen to you now, because they were about to lose millions of dollars by having the majority black body, student body, who are the athletes, go off, not play on that game day. So they were a threat to the power in terms of economics, and that is when they said, okay, we'll listen to this student now. In 1950 denotes the first African Americans who were admitted begrudgingly to the university because they were completely excluded. This is post-World War II. So when we think about, that tradition of excluding large segments of society in egalitarianism, and we think of how recent it is and how the issues that we're dealing with today are not that far, we're not that far removed, but yet they are obfuscated by a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the media, a lot of noise in our society where we can't really see the direct links to this. But that's what we're doing, right? When we're thinking as scholars, as students, we're trying to make those connections from the history, the text, institutional power, and where do we see it today? And the goal is, where do we stand? Where do we seek? Do we seek to maintain that order, or do we seek to make society a better place? As we said, in politics or in our world, in the existence of humanity, there is no neutrality. You have to pick a side, right? And it's not either or, but it kind of is, because being neutral, as the French thinker, writer Albert Camus said, if you choose the side of by doing nothing, you have chosen the side of the oppressor, right? By saying I do not want to get involved, you have taken the side and solidified the status quo. So Black Lives Matter, again, some more images here. The Mauna Kea resistance to the telescope on native lands, a mountain, sacred mountain in Hawaii. And we know of indigenous resistance is ongoing right now as we speak on the islands there. Hong Kong, 2014. And where are you? Politics is everywhere. As we're talking and thinking about what is political, what are social movements, how is American society structured around these institutions of power? Well, it is everywhere. There is no inside, there is no outside. We are all part of it. And becoming more aware of how power operates over us, you are more empowered to do something, to enact your agency, your ability to either move freely or not move freely in every realm of civil society, in institutional forms of power, in entertainment, and your opportunities that you will have or have closed off to you. And some might be because of class differential. We know the wealthy elite have already been born into a form of legacy that will enable their children and clear them a path direct to maybe an Ivy League institution, whereas we are proudly doing it through other forms. So, and that one of the places is here at the community college, as I'm very proud to say, where we are all learning collectively. We are all building that better society and social movements. I just wanted to highlight in this mini lecture how effective it is, and it is the tool of the people, of the masses, to challenge the 0.004% of the population that controls wealth and power in the United States. So we'll leave it at that for now. And these are the questions that we leave. Where are we going? Where are we headed? And we hope to see how we're going to expand the public sphere and expand a democracy, a real democracy, where it's not only a democracy for the few, but a democracy for all.